Okay, so we're going to pick up with part two of this first lecture, and we're going to continue with Sir Albert Howard, who is considered to be the father of the organic movement or organic agriculture. His law of return is certainly one that describes most of the practices that we follow today under the kind of the organic standards that we follow. Certainly, there's been some tweaks and adjustments, as in any theory, but in general, Sir Albert Howard's theory of or law of return is kind of at the heart of organics, and so we'll talk a lot about it. Not I won't always talk about the law of return, but we'll certainly talk about the aspects of it as we move through the class, because that's basically, at least from the soil point of view, that is what this class is about. And so we'll return and visit this again. I would encourage you, if you have time or interest, to read his book. I've put a copy of it on the class website, The Soil and Health, and it is a good read. It's a little bit, it's a little bit intense and a little bit detailed, but it is a good. If you really want to get a better understanding, it's a good way to go. And it's certainly I'm going to cover most of the information in kind of a more simplified view, but if you want to kind of read, where it began or who started it, that's the place to go. So the other person that we need to talk about is Rudolf Steiner, and Rudolf Steiner comes along kind of on the heels of Sir Albert Howard and takes a lot of the ideas of organic agriculture that Sir Albert Howard proposes and adds kind of another dimension, you might say. Some people would say it's a kind of a spiritual dimension, the idea of looking at the farm as a whole, but also as an organism itself, kind of as a living thing, separate, kind of, again, elevating the soil to kind of a living thing. So it's a little bit more beyond the Sir Albert Howard's idea of the soil as a system. And many people have issues with biodynamics, although there are biodynamic growers selling biodynamic products. So people do follow this practice, primarily in Europe and Australia and places like that. And we'll talk more about biodynamics at the end of the semester. I just wanted to kind of get his name out there. He's basically considered the father of biodynamic agriculture. Fritz Haber is definitely someone to talk about, although from an organic point of view, a lot of people would say, well, he's kind of the bad guy. He's certainly not the bad guy, but he did, among other things, he was involved in the development of lots of bad chemicals during World War I. So in that respect, he was a bad guy. But he, in all that work that he did, he developed a process to basically to synthesize ammonia, to make ammonia from nitrogen gas and hydrogen, heating them up and compressing them. In fact, his process has become known as the Haber process, and it is the means by which we make commercial nitrogen fertilizer today. And so a lot of people say, well, that's the beginning of the end. That's, once we have, it's one thing to talk about the law of the minimum and the need for these nutrients and the kind of the overemphasis on or the kind of the heavy emphasis on these fertilizer elements as the way to grow a healthy plant, kind of to the exclusion of the rest of the things living and so forth in the soil. But once we can manufacture the nitrogen fertilizer on a wholesale, inexpensive basis, then obviously it becomes kind of a worldwide thing. And some people would argue even further increases the dependence on commercial fertilizers. Now, it turns out this process was very cheap back when we had when fuel and oil was really cheap. Natural gas is typically, part of the geology of the soil. It's typically rests above oil reserves, and it was seemed to be unlimited supply and was very inexpensive. Of course, that's changed, and so now the production of nitrogen fertilizers become more expensive, and as a result, people are starting to go, hey, maybe we put a little too much out there or too much emphasis on making the nitrogen fertilizer. Perhaps we should go back and look at some of the ideas of organics, and this is actually the beginning of the two, perhaps maybe at least coming closer together, so there isn't such a divide between the two. But that's Fritz Haber's contribution to it all, is the manufacture of ammonia, synthetic ammonia fertilizer. Walter Northbourne, I'm going to just throw his name out here. I probably won't ever talk about him again, but he's the person that gets credit for actually coining the term organic in relation to farming. Good or bad, it's a term that got kind of associated with this form of farming that Sir Albert Howard advocated, and so it got connected to him and that form of agriculture. So now the word organic is kind of hard to extract out, even though it's probably not the best word because of that conflict I mentioned earlier with the kind of the chemistry definition. It does kind of cause some problems there, but anyway, that's Walter Northbourne's. I mean, he obviously did other things. He published some books that were very influential in kind of about the care of soil and the management of soil. But I'm putting him in my talk today for this coining the term organic. J.I. Rodale is really a big name in both organic research and in primarily in publishing. He was already wealthy when he started this endeavor. He basically supported both Sir Albert Howard and Rudolf Steiner. He was very interested in the idea of organic farming. He basically established a farm outside of Emmaus, Pennsylvania in 1930. He started a publishing empire that is to this day is a very large publishing company. It's grown into something pretty big. When I was in college, Organic Gardening was a small little magazine that came out once a month, and that was it. That's where you got your information from. Of course, now we have the internet, and there's a gazillion different magazines and blogs and websites. But in the day, it was the source. It was your source of information. They had a book club. You could get books through the club. They still sell books and publish all kinds of publications about landscaping and plants and so forth. But their beginnings started with promotion of organic farming and gardening. So he gets credit for really being the person that takes this information and makes it available to basically the average person, at least in the United States. Rachel Carson gets on my list of kind of who's who in the history of organic agriculture, primarily because of her book Silent Spring, which was written in 1962. She was an ecologist or aquatic biologist, and she became concerned when she started, through her studies and her research, started recognizing the damage or influence of pesticides on the environment, particularly the insecticide DDT, and particularly its effects on amphibians, which anything that lays an egg, basically, and because it turns out it makes the eggshells really thin and caused a lot of problems with fish and snakes and frogs and even birds, particularly the bald eagle. So her book really kind of draws attention to the harmful effects from DDT and agriculture pesticides, and really is kind of a moment in time when suddenly, and not necessarily everybody, but suddenly a lot of people became aware of this. Hey, maybe all these chemicals that we're using, or maybe there are some environmental hazards or issues related to them, and perhaps we need to look at things differently. And so a lot of people kind of think of that as the kind of the beginning of the more current organic movement. Certainly, it was the kind of the instigator of the first Earth Day, and out of that, an interest in organic gardening and farming. USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has certainly been around for a long time, since the 1800s. Certainly has a very strong connection to land-grant universities, of which University of Georgia is one. Supports and sponsors cooperative extension agents who are farm advisors in every county. The Soil Conservation Service has recently been renamed to the NCRS, Natural Conservation Research, Natural Resource Conservation Service. I always get that acronym mixed up. But anyway, supporting and advocating for erosion control, wise farming practices. Some people would argue that in the past, USDA has overly emphasized the reliance on fertilizers and chemicals, and kind of supported the law of the minimum and this whole idea of let's use more fertilizer to grow bigger, faster, taller plants. And of course, now we're moving into the area of genetics, and a lot of people say, well, that's all, a lot of people point the finger at USDA. In general, the organization has promoted scientific-based research practices. Unfortunately, a lot of those practices that were researched tend to support products, because that then supports the research. So certainly a lot of the research that's been done on agriculture has been product driven, hence the reliance on pesticides and chemicals, because those are products that then can be sold, and then those companies can then support the research. So there is a bit of a cycle there. There aren't nearly as many companies making and selling things that sell to organic growers, so there's not as many products to sell, not quite as much money there, not as much research, and so forth. So it is kind of a cycle, but we are breaking that cycle now as we begin to recognize the value and the contribution of all the rest of the components of the soil other than those elements, those chemical elements. And somewhere in all that, USDA has slowly come around and become more interested in organic. Certainly they have a lot of grant programs now to support organic research and organic agriculture. And beginning in the 1990s, they began to develop organic standards, some kind of guidelines. Up until that point, often you would see words organic and natural, healthy, all kinds of words would appear on packages, but there were really no national standard or guidelines. So USDA kind of took it upon itself to kind of create these standards, and in the early 1990s came out with the National Organic Standards. They created a board that developed these standards. The first set of standards came out. Many people said, hey, those standards are pretty thin. They're pretty vague. They're not very restrictive. You could do almost anything. So there was a lot of criticism. So they kind of went back to the drawing board and came out with another set of standards, which was then adopted in 2001. And for the most part, those are the standards that we follow today. And within those standards, there's guidelines for what products can be used, guidelines for how to be certified, and I've posted a link to their website, and you can read more about it. There's a whole certification process for growers. There's the Organic Materials Research Institute, which is an independent body that evaluates all materials that are used. And we'll talk about these as we move through the class. But basically, what the law did, the Farm Bill that created the National Organic Standards Board and the National Organic Program, basically it becomes a set of rules: what you can and can't do, what you can and can't apply, how long you have to wait for this, how you have to handle this, and it gives us a kind of a template in which to operate under. And then an individual farmer can then apply to be certified, demonstrate that they've adhered to these standards, pay a fee, and then get the certification, and then sell their products under the label. So for good or for worse, it has given us kind of at least something, a national standard by which we operate. But many people would argue to this day that certainly there are examples, and we see them all the time in documentaries and things. There are examples of USDA certified, particularly in the animal area, but certainly USDA certified crops that are grown that may not necessarily fit within our or your own personal definition of what organic is. And so I've asked you, that's why I've asked you in our first official module discussion to give me, I want to kind of hear your definition of organic, and that's what that is for. That's what I want you to elaborate on for this module discussion. The National Organic Program covers fresh and processed products, including crops and livestock. And there is, like I said, there is the Organic Materials Review. I called it research, excuse me. It's the Review Institute that is basically a national nonprofit organization. If you have a chemical or a product that you think could be used or should be used by organic growers and is eligible, you submit the research on that product. You give them it's kind of like FDA approving food and drugs. It's kind of like EPA approving pesticides. It's essentially a board that reviews applications for products to be sold and make sure that they fall under the guidelines of this program. And again, I posted a link to it, but if you are particularly if you're a beginning organic gardener and you just want to get some idea of where to begin, what's okay to use, what's not okay to use, it's a big list, but it is a searchable index. You can go on there and you can look and see what's on the list, what's not on the list. And what I always tell people is, if you don't have a strong opinion or reason for why you're using something or not using something, the default could be, well, I'm just going to follow whatever the National Organic Program says I can do. At least that's a national guideline, and I can look it up online, I can look up the material, and I can decide yes or no based on that. So at least it's a basis by which to make decisions. Okay, I kind of squeezed a lot of information in there, but that concludes the first lecture, part 1 and part 2. Hopefully I'll get a little bit better at condensing this information down And again, I welcome feedback on how this is going for you, and whether this is a good amount of time and you can understand me clearly, all that kind of thing. Please, 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 please give me feedback on